You're listening to Wellnow, Slate's podcast on health and wellness. I'm Kavita Patel.
And I'm Maya Feller. Mental health is a topic, Kavita, that we've both wanted to tackle in multiple ways as we started making this show, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I think we had to try to resist the temptation to have the entire set of podcasts be about mental health. And that's for good reason. It's just something that deserves more conversation, has so much of an impact on all aspects of our life and health and wellness. And we recently had a powerful conversation with New York State Health Commissioner Ashwin Vasan on the detrimental impact social media has on teen mental health. And before that, we talked about the rise of eating disorder diagnoses amongst boys and men with Dr. Jason Nagata.
Yeah, both of those were really powerful conversations. And this week, we're going to continue the conversation about men's mental health at large. So, to be clear, people of all genders can experience mental illness, and we can all be impacted by feelings and emotions that have a real impact and effect on our mental health. We also know through data that there are gender-based differences in anxiety and depression. Women are twice as likely to develop depression. However, men die by suicide more often, and it seems that depression may be underdiagnosed in men. Be a man, man up. These are all sayings that so many of us have heard. The implicit understanding is that men, especially cisgender men, are supposed to be strong all the time. So this performance of that dominant definition of masculinity leaves such little space for vulnerability. And it really, in my estimation, Kavita, I feel like it encourages this toxic behavior and thinking. In fact, there's still this stigma associated with men seeking support for their mental health, according to a 2020 study from the National Institute of Health. Kavita, what trends have you seen in your work regarding men and mental health?
Well, I'm pleased to say when I started my medical career, I actually did research amongst African Americans in South Central Los Angeles, specifically to focus on depression screening in men. So this was early 2000s, trying to understand how could we do simple 2-question screenings to actually diagnose and treat depression amongst Black men because of so much of what you mentioned about stigma. And maybe this won't shock you. It did not shock me, but it certainly made waves in research, was that it turns out like a doctor or a nurse or even a health professional, unless that health professional was a Black man, that those were not the people that anybody turned to, especially men, when they wanted to kind of talk through depression or depression screening. The most success we had were in barbershops, in movie theaters, in churches, in places where not only do people congregate, but that they can find someone who looks like them, who can talk to them without judgment. So that was probably how it started in my career. And it has only manifested by me understanding that when there's someone sitting in the room, I start to talk about mental health, but I know it's important to have kind of a team of people that can really help that person, especially if it's a young man. I don't see children. If it's a young man, I know it matters kind of who that person talks to. So I've assembled like a little Rolodex of different mental health providers who can meet that need. It doesn't always have to be a male, but it can be at least someone who's had experience and can deal with the stigma that you talk about. Maya, how about you? I know that there's sometimes perceptions about diet and nutrition tilting also towards women, but how has mental health and men and adolescents even manifested?
I mean, that's a fantastic question, Kavita. So when I think about the men that we see in our practice, one thing that really stands out to me is that when the women present for their nutrition sessions, most of them are actually connected to therapy already when in that initial session, and fewer of the men are. And also, when we see men, more of the men tend to have significant substance use and misuse reported. So it's interesting because this is just like a small practice, and I see the data kind of replicating itself in my experience. Now, Kavita, I know this is a personal question for you. I know you have a son like I do. And have you thought about boys and mental health?
Oh, all the time. And we recall speaking with Dr. Jason Nagata about eating disorders. I think about that all the time. I even see glimpses of my son kind of sucking in, he's 9, sucking in his stomach because he's had some kids tell him like that he appears fat. He's also got some teeth. He's had braces before. And just the other day, he said, people make fun of my teeth. I wish I had straighter teeth. And it just started, unfortunately, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. So I've actually been engaging in kind of like what would otherwise be considered, kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, not myself, but other health professionals kind of engaging in that with my family, because I just can't describe how much I see and how much I can predict almost. It's almost to a pattern. I can predict if I do see not only my son, but if I can see this pattern emerging, everything from body dysmorphism, eating disorders, perceptions that are manifested in social media. I can see it all. And it all feels like it ends in something incredibly, just incredibly toxic. And so this is definitely on my mind, and I'm really looking forward to a deeper conversation.
As am I. And I can say, I've got a teen son who is very compelled with being fit in all the ways that we have talked about. And he's not alone. It really ripples through his friend group as well. So, Kavita, I think I know the perfect person to have this conversation with, and it's going to be a good one. After the break, we'll bring in Dr. Mike Dow to help better understand men's mental health.
Hey, Wellnow listeners, if you're enjoying the show and want to hear more, subscribe to our feed. New episodes come out every Wednesday morning. While you're there, check out our other episodes too, like last week's where we continued conversations on weight and health. We had to cover GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, and others. There's a lot of noise about these drugs. We dive into the complex facts with Dr. Fatima Cody Stanford, who treats patients with obesity and teaches aspiring doctors about it at Harvard. You won't want to miss it.
Americans take about 20,000 breaths a day and spend an average of 90% of their time indoors. The indoor air we breathe can be up to 100 times more polluted than outdoor air, according to the EPA. Indoor air pollutants can cause respiratory symptoms like sneezing, congestion, scratchy throat, and even more serious health problems like lung and heart disease. So what's the solution? Introducing Air Doctor, the air purifier that filters out 99.99% of dangerous contaminants so your lungs don't have to. This includes allergens, pollen, pet dander, dust mites, mold spores, and even bacteria and viruses. Air Doctor comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you don't love it, just send it back for a refund, minus shipping. Head to airdoctorpro.com and use promo code wellnow, and you'll receive up to $300 off air purifiers. Exclusive to podcast customers, you'll also receive a free 3-year warranty on any unit, which is an additional $84 value. Lock in this special offer by going to airdoctorpro.com and use promo code wellnow.
Whatever you think about the presidential campaign circus, one thing is guaranteed. The U.S. Supreme Court is going to be absolutely central to what happens in the coming election, and they've just released a raft of decisions that reach into just about every aspect of your life, from pollution to air travel, abortion rights, gun violence, and of course, presidential immunity. I'm Dahlia Lithwick, and we just wrapped up our Opinion Palooza series on Amicus, Slate's podcast about the courts and the law, where we break down the weedy details of Supreme Court news to make it accessible to real, smart, non-lawyer people like you. It has been a truly mind-boggling 7 weeks of news from the High Court, and we want to make sure that you understand it all. All of the episodes in this series are now available, and if you become a Slate Plus subscriber, you'll get access to a whole bunch of bonus episodes too, like The Court of King Alito, where we examine how this justice's fondness for flag-waving intersects with how he does his day job. Listen to Opinion Palooza on Amicus Now. That's AMICUS, wherever you're listening now.
Welcome back. You're listening to Well Now from Slate. I'm Kavita Patel.
And I'm Maya Feller. So when we talk about mental health, we often have to navigate the large amount of stigma that it comes with. This could be especially hard for boys and men who are told in our culture that in many ways, the inherently, quote, unmanly, unquote, is to talk about feelings, which is a big reason why I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. We welcome my friend, New York Times bestselling author, Dr. Mike Dow. He's also the co-host and the resident psychotherapist on Nick Cannon's new TV show, Counsel Culture.
I got a daughter, so my whole approach to women changes.
People get really confused about what they really want in love.
For you to say I'm acting white and gay, you're closed-minded.
If I don't know anything about you, it's very easy for me to hate you.
We're in America, like freedom of speech. We should be able to say Shabbat Shalom.
I was married for 7 years, and I failed at it.
Councilman, how do you deal with anxiety?
Toxic masculinity.
Social media.
Mental health. It's refreshing. Y'all get vulnerable with each other. Y'all are just normal.
This is Counsel Culture.
And the goal of the show is to get men to sit down and be honest about their feelings and sometimes, open up about those struggles with mental health. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, my friend.
All right, Mike, I'm going to kick off very basic. How do you define wellness?
What's so interesting, Maya and I met doing lots of TV shows and, this integrative, holistic sense of wellness, right? So even in this field of mental health, what does it mean to be happy? And, I really always go back to the 4 quadrants of bio, psychosocial, spiritual wellness and healing. And, especially because I am, my other passions in my latest book, The Ketamine Breakthrough, I spend most of my time doing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So I really define wellness not as in the allopathic Western model of symptoms and the reduction of symptoms, but really a whole picture of what it means to be optimized, what it means to feel peaceful. Maya and I used to do shows really looking at the intersection of nutrition and mental health. Most of my books have a lot of nutrition in it because I believe that all of the things that Maya does, and I'm sure you do, Kavita, in your practices, it's so essential, right? So even these simple things like inflammation and how does inflammation increase or decrease a risk for mental illnesses? So, to me, it's really everything. It's talking about your feelings. It's feeling heard and seen. It's having a purpose. It's meaning. It's eating a diet. Even the things that I eat in my diet, there's a very spiritual and intentional reason why I do everything. And I look at a lot of different data to determine what I want to eat or write about, what I think is healthy. So to me, wellness is that full picture of, are all of those quadrants, bio, psychosocial, spiritual, are they all aligned? So biology, things like inflammation, psycho, how is your mental state? Are you not thinking in patterns like black or white thinking? Are you really optimistic? We know that the social, especially post-COVID, people are still not used to being connected, but we know that connection, whether you have, our little rescue pup behind me, or a strong network of friends. And of course, the spiritual too, which I think is increasingly lost in this modern world. And the more we can mine those 4 quadrants, that to me is true wellness.
Mike, I love how you have brought the intersectionality of those 4 quadrants together. And I do have to give you a major shout out because this is not new, right? So people might be thinking about this more in the last 5 years, but this is a path that you have been on for decades, and you have always looked at overall wellness and mental health and wellness from a very vast perspective. So that's something that I really appreciate. Now, let's fast forward. It's 2024, and we've made so many advances in mental health. However, there's still this stigma that comes along with men seeking treatment for care. Can you tell us why you think this is the case?
Yeah, this is so important, right? Because I think in this day and age, especially with what is going on in our world, I feel like the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. This toxic masculinity was a really big buzzword. What was that, about 5 or Yeah, 4 or 5 years ago, people really started to talk about that. And then the pandemic and what does it mean to be this, quote, hyper masculine? I really believe that we all have a lot of yin, feminine, and yang masculine energy within all of us. But I really think it has to do with this syndrome that men particularly are diagnosed with. And it's the, I don't want to talk about it, right? It's like, that is the thing. If you don't want to talk about it, it has to go somewhere. So why are women diagnosed with anxiety and depression about twice as often as men? But inversely, why are men diagnosed with addiction or substance use disorders 2-to-1 men to women? It's not that men don't suffer. It's that they are told to internalize and to self-medicate it more, to do dangerous things, to use alcohol, drugs, foods, risky sexual behavior to really help themselves to feel better. And, when I'm working with somebody, I go all the way back to the very beginning. And a lot of times those attachment wounds and their inner child is really, really lonely and sad and suffering. And I would even say that, some of the people that we, look at our society and who are doing the things that make people cringe. I would love to do some inner child work with those men because I know that somewhere in there is an inner child who feels not good enough, unlovable, alone. And, over the inner child is the ego that is trying to do all of these things. Even power is a way that men medicate and use something to deal with that pain that they have. So I think it's society. It's the way we've been taught, as men to not talk about our feelings or to internalize or even use relationships or one night stands to really make ourselves feel better. And that's what we need to change.
Yeah. Mike, that inner child dialogue that you just mentioned, that's so profound because when I think about just society at large and I go back to how kids are supposed to play, you're completely right. It starts from the beginning where there's this way that you perform masculinity versus femininity and what little boys are supposed to do. That's pretty heavy duty stuff. So, Mike, you've written a number of New York Times bestsellers on mental health and brain health. I'd love for you to give us the link between brain health, mental health, and then men in particular.
Yeah. So, I think all of us are on the same page here that what is good for the body is good for the brain, right? So some of the same labs that a cardiologist or a primary care physician is going to be looking at have a profound impact on your mental health. So things like inflammation. So maybe a cardiologist is looking at something like an HSCRP, C-reactive protein, which is this general measure of inflammation. And if that is over 1, a lot of times that means that there is systemic inflammation, and that includes your brain. So, I talk a lot about anti-inflammatory foods. It's why fish oil in high doses in one study was proven to be as effective as SSRI antidepressants. And it really sheds light on a shift in thinking, right? Because since the 1950s, there is this monoamine hypothesis that says, well, mental illness is just the result of neurotransmitters that need to be turned up or down. So if you have depression, you turn up the serotonin. If you have anxiety, turn up the GABA with benzodiazepines, and that'll just fix everything, right? And of course, there's a piece of that makes sense. And if somebody has schizophrenia and is psychotic, we probably want to modify the dopamine levels, right? But that is probably not where it started. In fact, if somebody just had a tendency to have one neurotransmitter that's out of balance, when we look at the lifelong risk for all people, if you're diagnosed with one mental illness, you're very likely to be diagnosed with another one at a different point in your life. So it's not just that one neurotransmitter. It's far more systemic. So it's about inflammation. It's about, those vitamins, right? It's about those amino acids. So a lot of people don't understand the way that some of these amino acids need cofactors. So for example, if you're eating these amino acids like tryptophan and tyrosine, which then thanks to a lot of these vitamins, can then be converted into your own serotonin and dopamine. That's one pathway. And then, of course, everybody is now talking about gut health, and especially in this era of COVID, that affects your gut and the way this phenomenon of dysbiosis of, not enough good gut bacteria or too much bad bacteria, which can be affected by stress, alcohol, the COVID virus, all of these things. And we have to remember that a lot of those good gut bacteria also manufacture your own serotonin, GABA, dopamine in your gut. So you can kind of see it's not this, there's just one place in the body that if you just turn up that dial, that's going to fix everything. No, it has to do with everything. Now, how does this relate specifically to men? Now, I do have to say, in research, unfortunately, a lot of studies are done in men, which creates this bias against women. And, I think a lot of times what's said is the researchers don't want to account for, hormones, and, women have hormones that shift more often than men. So I think we're doing women a disservice there. But, when we think about all of these things, and when I think about the men that I work with, I'm an epigenetic counselor, so I'm looking at everything from, do you have a copy of APOE4, which makes you more likely to be diagnosed with dementia, or MTHFR, which prevents the B vitamins in your diets to be metabolized into their active forms so that also your body can make more serotonin and dopamine. I think most men that I work with don't have this holistic bend, so if I'm in Brooklyn or Manhattan or LA, or, I've spent a lot of time in, I was in the hometown of Walmart for a week shooting a show. I'm forgetting the city, but I've spent a lot of time in different cities, and I'm always observing the way people eat and the way that they act. And, from a relational point of view, what do we know in relationships leads to divorce and breakups? A lot of stonewalling and defensiveness. And so I see that men tend to stonewall and get defensive, right? So if there's the stereotype of the nagging wife and the man who shuts down and goes to play video games or watch football in his basement, a lot of times, not always, but I do see some of that playing out. So I think that's the psychological piece. And then I typically I think men are getting the message, but, it's that very typical men are going to have the double cheeseburger, fries, whiskey, beer, and a lot of these things that are just terrible for brain health. And, I think women are the ones who are, why do advertisers target women? They still to this day make most, again, not all of the buying decisions, but then it's, I can't tell you how many sessions I've done with wives who say, how do I get my husband who has diabetes and depression to stop eating like an 8-year-old processed foods every day? And I say, well, I can't work with him unless he comes to see me. But, it tends to be a very common narrative. So I think those are really the factors.
All right. So, Mike, you're the resident psychotherapist on Counsel Culture. I actually wanted to just bring up something because people are listening to this. It's a podcast. Counsel Culture is spelled Counsel. And the only reason I point that out is I think in and of itself, that tells us something. Counsel versus Counsel, Council. And I actually pulled up Merriam-Webster. The difference is important because counsel, the way you kind of put it in the show, is word for advice, kind of a community, like kind of giving advice or guidance, versus counsel, which is a bit more Council, advisory, or in some ways hierarchical in some regard. Tell us why it was so important to create a counsel, a real kind of safe space for this group discussion. And maybe if you want to even offer just a little bit of, you've done a season, or at least that's what we see on Prime, kind of anything that struck you or surprised you.
To your point, Kavita, I think that the fact that you can have I'm a BIPOC Asian queer man with a straight Black man as the host, and then every episode we have somebody like Howie Mandel or somebody who is known for anger management problems, like Matt Barnes from the NBA, sitting next to a comedian, or Dr. Sheila Nazarian, who is a plastic surgeon, but also an advocate for Jewish Americans and, some of the rights. She talked a lot about her personal story. The fact that we can have all of these communities together as equals, people as famous as Howie Mandel or Neo, Nick Cannon, sitting next to a me, and we're all open talking about our feelings, it really does give that feeling. Somebody said it's like, oh, it's like watching group therapy. And that's, the power of the group. We all in our own minds, one of the functions of the ego is it really is there to protect us, because if we were all just one ball of beautiful, loving energy, and then somebody came to attack you in the face, you wouldn't move. So there's a reason for the separateness, right? And that's what the ego is trying to do. But the ego also does something that is a disservice. Namely, it really says, well, I have this and you're different than me, so therefore you don't understand my problems. And you have this other disease of terminal uniqueness, where you think I'm the only one who has this problem. I'm the only one who knows what it's like to walk in my shoes. And while, yes, a queer man is going to have different POVs and feelings and things that he's had to deal with, and a black man versus a Jewish woman versus, and so on and so forth. The fact that we can all be together and there's something that brings us together that we relate to, and it's almost like we're all equals. When Nick Cannon is moved to tears talking about his loss and what his grief journey was, as a counterpoint to, when do you usually hear Nick Cannon's name? As a punchline about having too many kids. But this is also a father who lost a child, who loves his children. And you're like, oh, I need to maybe rethink that.
Nick, how we doing?
Yeah, talk to us, Nick.
It brings up a lot. Just, with how we was just saying, like, you want it to get easier.
Right.
And it's a part of, maybe it's the ego, maybe it's whatever, because you want to be like strong, keeping it together. I don't know, like when it comes up, it just takes over you. Yeah. And I was going to say this because some of my defense mechanisms is humor. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm good. I'm that guy when you ask, how are you? I'm good. I woke up this morning. I'm good as milk on Mondays. And you know what I mean? Like, I always got something to say. But when it's those real moments and hearing people talk, it just triggers stuff. And I don't know. I still struggle with ultimately just overly emoting.
When I can have somebody who posted something out of what I believe was sheer ignorance, sitting down with somebody who represents a culture that they offended, I believe that in this day and age, that's exactly what we need, right? Because algorithms are great. I love my Spotify algorithm because it's really good at suggesting, I put things in a playlist and I'm like, wow, now I can discover all these new songs and it knows what I'm looking for. Great. But when it comes to other forms of social media, I love my dog. I love rescue animals. We fostered a dog last year, but I'm almost sort of sick of, like, I want to discover other things on Instagram besides rescue animals, right? Because I remember, 5 or 10 years ago. So I think it really just keeps us in these very narrow lanes. Like, oh, I'm a dog lover. I'm a queer man dog lover. So therefore, this is what advertisers think that I want to see. Which is great sometimes, but it's also, I don't think that human experience of oneness or connectivity and some of these things, that if we put down the ego, that we all have things in common, right? When I'm doing couples therapy or ketamine-assisted couples therapy, the themes and the drives and the desires and the pain that I see is far more alike in human beings. It's pretty predictable, even though it's unique, than it is dissimilar, right? We all want to be loved. We all want to be seen. We all want to connect. So I hope that that's what the show does.
we're going to take a break here. And when we come back, we'll hear more from Dr. Mike Dow on men's mental health. You're listening to Well Now from Slate. I'm Maya Feller.
And I'm Kavita Patel. And we're continuing our conversation with Dr. Mike Dow about men and mental health. Mike, on social media, and I have to say you're brilliant at bringing in, I think, what I would often classify as slightly taboo topics and just normalizing them. You actually spoke about using body awareness as a way to slow the urge to cancel someone. I just find that fascinating. It's so many things wrapped up into that as a society that we all kind of have inside of us, but we just don't bring out explicitly. Can you just talk a little bit more about this and what kind of moved you to post this?
So I really believe that if you take the person in this world, whether it's a political candidate or somebody who did something, we all have that drive inside of us. It's just a matter of what do we do with it, right? And I think that's really helpful because I believe that the beliefs that we have about ourselves, am I good? Am I bad? Am I lovable? Am I unlovable? If we can pay attention to the body and we notice that gut instinctual reaction, because listen, the ego is going to speak first and it usually speaks loudest. And if you can bring a lot of that somatic or bodily awareness to your reactions, and then you connect that to, what I often in the type of therapy that I use, I'll call that, the higher self or your true self. Neurologically speaking, we're trying to connect the most human part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And it's been said that if your soul lived in a part of the brain, it would be the prefrontal cortex. So we have all of these reactions. And, because of things like the vagus nerve and the mind-body connection, when the ego or, even the way adrenaline is released in the body and then the norepinephrine, which is what it's called in the brain, we feel that pit in our stomach or like that feeling like we want to jump at that person. And the norepinephrine in the brain makes thoughts go very, very quickly. We can be more prone to anger. So then we want to create this container. And instead of listening or blending with that reaction and then believing that reaction is me, and then if you follow that time and time again, then you actually have a belief about yourself that I'm a bad person, I'm a violent person, I'm a reactive person. What if instead of classifying ourselves in those ways, we could say, hey, we all have that. It's a matter of what you do with it. And before we're even consciously aware, the body is usually the first place you're going to feel something. I mean, if you've ever been in that experience, I got rear-ended 10 years ago. And I remember before I was even consciously aware of having the thought, I'm about to get rear-ended, when I heard the screeching tires and I was at a stoplight, where's the first place you feel it? In your body, before you even have the thought, oh, shoot, I'm going to get rear-ended. And so if we can begin with the first place where we feel it and then allow the higher parts of who we are to then start to kick in, because, the brain is really interesting. It's not that we just threw out the old parts of the brain through evolution. It's almost like we took an old, oh gosh, I remember when I was a little kid, I had a Commodore 64, right? So it's not like one of the very first computers. So it's not that we threw out the Commodore 64. Imagine you had a Commodore 64 and then you had like an early 90s Hewlett-Packard PC, and then you had a Mac, and now you have a Mac with AI capability. When you think about the brain, it's not that we threw out the Commodore 64. It's almost like all of these other versions were built on top of that. So we still have these primitive urges that we share with animals, but then we also have the human part of ourselves. So I really believe that if we can be more attuned to our bodies, it allows us to access the most human parts of us.
Mike, I love that analogy. It hits home and resonates. Kavita, I'm sure it hits for you too, because yeah, right? It's like we're building on top of kind of just, nature that exists within each of us. And that's something that you all do in Counsel Culture, is that you create this space where men can be brave and they can be vulnerable. And I mean, watching it, it's actually quite extraordinary because we've never seen anything like this where people are just sitting in their honesty and their vulnerability. And then they talk about addiction and trauma and loss and depression and all of these parts of our lives that we don't see openly discussed, especially across like, you know, such a wide span of men from older to younger, just so much, right?
Yeah.
So talk to us, because this is the work that you do, Mike, about cultivating that safe, brave space on the show, and then how we ourselves, so folks like Kavita and I, listeners, can translate that into our own lives and for the men that are in our lives.
Yeah. So I remember having chills when Lamar Odom was on talking about his story. And, you know, after this recent breakup, and then he was famously found having a stroke while at a brothel, I believe in Nevada.
My mother passed away when I was 12 years old. And the only thing I had, you know, to replace that love was the basketball.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Then when my son passed away, I just went straight to the cocaine.
And just having chills and talking about his pain. And of course, going back to the way men deal with pain, what did he use? He was using sex in a way of medicating his pain. And just the fact that he was able to talk about that.
I think what woke my ass up was losses.
Right.
I lost everything I love. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Lost my wife, had a terrible relationship with my kids that's growing now. But, you know, when you lose, then you learn.
But what were we modeling on that show? You know, in that moment, it was just sometimes sitting in the silence. It was just listening. And so I would say that you've got to have a great gut, which we all do. We all have this intuition. And sometimes I think if you know yourself, are you a people pleaser? Are you a helper? Are you a conflict avoider? Are you a high anxiety, pessimist? Are you always believing the catastrophic thoughts? We all know generally, who we are. And maybe you've done the Myers-Briggs, I'm an ENFJ, or you've taken the Big Five personality test and you have high levels of extroversion and openness. There are all these different tools if you want to figure out who you are, but most of us have a sense. So what you have to do is use your emotional intelligence to sometimes look at the interaction. So if you have, I'm going to go back to a couple that I worked with yesterday, and there was, again, this very stereotypical, but oftentimes true of the man was clamming up. So he was becoming very, very either defensive or just stonewalling and totally shutting down. And the more he shut down, the more his wife was criticizing and, even the micro things that you say to somebody. So if a man, somebody, a friend or a partner comes in the door and you're like, what's wrong with you, right? Or even if you say it a little bit more kindly than that, what is the message? It's, oh, there is something wrong with me that feels like a criticism and I'm not ready to talk about it. So if you can use your intuition of what that person needs to create the space, and a lot of times it's not in the first 5 seconds. I think I often say in sex therapy, this helps men to understand. I say that men are like microwaves when it comes to sexual response, and women are like crock pots, right? So when a man just is like, why doesn't my wife want sex? I just leaned over and tried to take off her clothes. It's like, wait, where's the foreplay? I think the opposite tends to be true with emotional connection. And sometimes men need a lot more time to really feel safe and feel comfortable. And I think that's what we model on the show. And we use a lot of that intuition or emotional intelligence to say, what does this person need to feel safe? And most of it is nonverbal, right? So it's really creating that space and then using your gut to really help that man in your life really feel safe. And also leading with vulnerability. I think the other thing that you see on the show is all of us open up. So even me as a professional, I talk a lot about my traumas and my pain and my hurt and what I've had to go through. That allows the other person to feel safe enough and not embarrassed or ashamed to talk about, his pain. So, instead of, like, well, what's wrong with you? Or, don't you think we should do something about our son? It's like, you find the space, you let it breathe, and you say, I have to tell you, I'm starting to feel so, when I get the reports that our kid is sitting all alone and having these issues, like I'm filled with this deep sadness. And then you wait. And you wait. And usually that is far more effective than, trying to sort of crack somebody open with sheer force, especially as men.
Mike, it's so many themes of kind of what you've touched on both in the show, just now in this discussion, kind of remind, and you've referenced it in the show, kind of thinking about stages of change, just what it takes to, whether it's anything from just getting up and creating a habit to, stop smoking, stopping something that could be an addictive behavior, and the stages of change kind of as we learn it, pre-contemplation, and then really kind of think about someone in that contemplation stage where they know there's a problem, they might not be ready, or they don't have the support or their confidence to take that action. What can the people around them do to give support? So, because we see that in your show, so much of this comes to that, having that like environment. I imagine that's part of the background motivation in creating the counsel for people. So what can people listening, maybe they're in the contemplation stage, maybe they know someone who wants to take action, what can they do to support that person?
I know that there is such a great intersection of psychology and behavior and, even these stages of change. And if we really meet people where they're at, and again, a lot of it goes back to the nonverbal. I think about all of these studies that say you're more likely to smoke if everybody around you smokes. You're more likely to exercise if everybody around you exercises. And so sometimes you can show your support by doing something. If somebody is going to stop smoking, I love behavioral replacement therapy. And I have to say, I work with a lot of people who almost died from the disease of addiction. And most of my addicts in long-term recovery who are really successful, who have 8, 10, 15 years of sobriety, I'm always really amazed that it's not that they extinguish that part of them that has these, quote, addictive qualities. They just traded it up, right? They just swapped it out for something that's healthier. So most of them are doing triathlons or they're marathon runners or they're yogis or they're really, they're channeling that energy. So if you can help that person by, instead of, well, maybe we should do this or maybe we should do that. Wouldn't it be great to support that person who quit smoking by, if it's your best friend and you text them, hey, in LA, I love Runyon Canyon, Runyon Canyon hike Saturday 11, because we know that those healthy behaviors are going to be the indirect way that, later in the day are going to lead to a decrease in cravings, right? You're getting endorphins, you're getting vitamin D in a natural way, as opposed to the in the moment, because when it comes to those unhealthy behaviors and those stages of change, we are often, again, going back to the body being the first one, the first place where we feel something. I think by the same token, the urges to do something healthy or unhealthy started far before you had that urge, right? So what was going on in your brain? And I think, if you think like that and you just meditate on that, what can you do to really help that person? I'm also thinking of this couple that I work with, and the partner really supports the vegan diet of his partner and researches vegan restaurants. And the partner is always blown away by, how meaningful that is that his partner took the time to do that, but what a great, it's a love language, right? It's like finding that Runyon Canyon or that restaurant, and really helping, because I know Maya, there's so many things in what you and I do. I'm always thinking about that intersection. It's like, well, this is the what, but we have to connect it with the how. And Kavita, I think the stages of changes are a piece of that. So yeah, focus not so much on the what, but sometimes the how, and also deeper the why.
Absolutely. I also think too, Mike, listening to you, that I love that the suggestion is to create a level up right? Or a swap up.
Mm-hmm.
And I just like that framing because it's like, okay, well, what's going to be the imprint that is the positive imprint? And it also makes me think, about people across the socioeconomic spectrum and also in terms of access. That's something that both Kavita and I talk about quite a bit. And there's so many people who don't have access to therapy. Perhaps it's not covered by their insurance or they don't, what are some of the resources that are free that you can suggest?
We know that a lot of the best forms of therapy are free. I believe that meditation can be a form of therapy, exercise, nature, all free forms of therapy. And you'd be surprised, a lot of people have this idea, and, especially in major metropolitan areas like New York and LA, this is largely true, in mental health. It's a very strange phenomenon, right? Because even in LA, New York, most cardiologists will take insurance, but most mental health professionals will not. So if you're in a smaller market, if you're in a mid-sized city or a smaller city, that phenomenon is usually not true. But even in the larger cities, you'd be surprised by how many people you can find in network. So there's a great therapist, psychiatrist finder on Psychology Today. And if you have any type of insurance, you just click the box. You can open a box and click, well, this is what I have. And then therapy doesn't have to be hundreds of dollars an hour. Sometimes it is a $10 or $20 copay. Medicare, Medi-Cal, a lot of these public systems, the VA will pay for therapy. Sometimes you do have to fight a little harder or wait a while to start. But one of the therapies that I use for PTSD, EMDR, in my private practice, they also use at the VA. Again, you're not going to get somebody probably this week, but if you start the process, you can find some of these groundbreaking therapies in a low-cost format. Even the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy that I do, there is a foundation that will pay for half of your first few sessions, a nonprofit. So there are resources, and then look for the specific ones, right? So as a member of the queer community here, and I know in LA, the LA Gay and Lesbian Center has free therapy. If you're part of the BIPOC community or, any community that you're a part of, there are usually nonprofits that offer some type of mental health. So if you don't have any type of insurance, starting there is a great place. And, one of the nice things about telehealth is that the cash pay telehealth option is usually much more affordable. So oftentimes, I'm the co-founder of a telehealth based platform. We're only available in New York and California right now, called the Non-Ordinary Therapy Company. And like some of the other well-known telehealth companies, therapy is not hundreds of dollars an hour. And, I'm really proud to say that we take insurance. So you can sometimes see one of our therapists for 10 or 20 bucks per session.
I think that the number of resources and accessibility points is so true. And it's even more amazing if you add into that, I've just been trying to get patients to especially try some of the meditation apps, to your point, other behavioral kind of apps, just something that helps them integrate it into something they're using every day, Mike, because let's be honest, we're all on our phones.
Yep.
And no matter what your socioeconomic status, no matter kind of race, ethnicity, the kind of smartphone tends to be the unifier.
Yeah.
There are even, I'm just going to put the plug out there for for expectant moms, there's Text for Baby. There's so many programs, to your point. It's just finding them. And maybe that can be the best thing that we do, is help others find it. So I appreciate your ability to suggest not just free resources, but pushing so that we can have more available for many different people. We don't want this to just be limited to certain groups that can access it and not. So that includes elderly, that includes young people. So I feel like we could talk forever. I think that it would just be great to hear you talk about the future for men's mental health and what might be on the horizon. You've already touched on kind of the role of everything from meditation, exercise, psychedelics. We've done a show on that. We've talked about that with some of the experts and talking about it with you as an expert. What's in the future? What do you hope we can be working on when we tape together in a year, 2 years, 5 years?
I cannot wait for some of these technologies and protocols to become more mainstream. So what I want to say to all of the men suffering out there is mental illness is treatable. So whether you're suffering with addiction or loneliness, there are these new therapies, new psychotherapies, right? Ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. But there are also these other types of protocols that are really, really effective. And especially if you're in, I don't think we've talked about this today, sometimes men have a problem. Psychotherapy feels like the harder place to start because that's the place that requires more openness. And if you have a lot of depression, what do men tend to do when they have depression? They really tend to isolate, right? So it's not the stereotypical weepiness or sadness as the primary symptom. Sometimes you just see that isolation. So if you can use some of these novel protocols that really help your brain. So for example, TMS, which stands for transcranial magnetic stimulation. And there's a new form of TMS that's even more effective called Saint TMS that is now available at certain sites, limited sites across the country. And it's still, that one is very expensive. The original TMS is covered by insurance usually. Neurofeedback is something that I use, ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, ketamine, there are all of these new models that are really, really helpful. And I think especially for men who have a problem starting with the therapy piece. And I think a lot of men go to, one of those touchy-feely therapists and they're like, oh, well, that didn't feel right to me, especially not starting out. And then they say, well, therapy's not for me. And if you're a man, erectile dysfunction is oftentimes, I hear, one of the main reasons they don't want to go on SSRIs because they're afraid of that particular side effect and loss of sexual function or desire. So I want to tell people that it's not one size fits all. There are many medications, many supplements, many protocols. We're just at the beginning, especially when we're dealing with the most complex organ, the brain. So don't give up hope. If you tried something, if it didn't work, we have all of these treatments and new treatments coming up on the horizon that are really going to help millions of Americans out there.
Mike, that is incredibly, incredibly hopeful. It has me thinking so much. Especially, I appreciate you highlighting what conventionally we think of as psychotherapy may not be the entry point for so many men, especially based on all of the things that we've talked about. So that gives me pause and it gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Yeah.
Mike Dow is a licensed therapist and the author of multiple books. You can see him in the Amazon Prime show, Counsel Culture. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
That's our show this week. Well Now is produced and edited by Vic Whitley-Berry with assistance from Christy Taiwo Macanjola. Ben Richmond is Slate's Senior Director of Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is Vice President of Audio.
We'd love to hear from you. Email us at wellnow@slate.com. If you want to support this show, please consider becoming a Slate Plus member. You'll get to listen to this show ad-free, as well as hear bonus material from some of your other favorite Slate podcasts, like Slow Burn and Amicus. You'll also have full access to all articles on Slate's website. And be sure to tune in next Wednesday as we tackle another part of the wellness industry. I'm Kavita Patel.
And I'm Maya Feller. Thanks for listening.